Hola! So the goal today is to go over some irregular verbs. All tenses have irregular verbs, so we're going to take a look at some of the common ones in the preterite tense that we need to be aware of in order to be able to use the tense more effectively. So we're going to take a look at verbs like ir and ser in the preterite, as well as HACER, PONER, ESTAR, TENER, to name a few, because they're spell change verbs and they look really weird in this tense. So a little review about how we use the preterite tense. We use it to talk about completed actions in the past, to talk about a series of completed actions. So first I did this, next I did this, then I did this. Or to talk about completed actions that have a definite duration, or we know how many times the actions took place. All three of these situations require that we use the preterite tense when referring to the past. So I completed something would be like, yo terminé la tarea. I finished the homework. It's done, it's over with. A series, like I said, would include something like, primero yo terminé la tarea. Después yo cociné la cena. Yo estudié por 2 horas. Yo estudié 5 veces. Alright, just to review the basic conjugations of regular verbs, we've got our AR endings, e, aste, o, amos, astes, aron, and ER and IR verbs, I, iste, io, imos, istes, ieron. Now these apply again for all of our regular verbs. We need to make sure that the accent marks are present, because if we forget them in this tense, we're going to accidentally use tenses we don't really mean to. So make sure to practice these if you need some more review. Alright, and then some basic irregulars that you've already talked about, hopefully, are CAR, GAR, and ZAR verbs. We're going to talk about DAR and VER, SER and IR, and then some verbs with spelling changes too. So all of these situations are irregular in the preterite, so we need to make sure that we know the rules and have these memorized, so that way when we come across these verbs in context, they're easy to use. So let's start with CAR, GAR, and ZAR verbs. Now, CAR, GAR, and ZAR verbs are a little bit different, so we're going to look for verbs that end with these. So CAR, like buscar, GAR, llegar, ZAR, almorzar, for example. So if a verb ends in these, again, buscar, llegar, and ZAR will use almorzar. The first thing is, whenever we see a verb that ends in one of these three items, we need to immediately recognize we need to be careful because they are irregular to an extent. So in the yo form of the preterite tense, these are going to have changes. Again, only in the yo form, not any other conjugation. They have a spelling change, and the reason behind that is pronunciation, just like most spelling changes. Without it, the words would sound really funky and wouldn't be as easy to pronounce. So when we have these changes, for example, buscar, car verbs, this is going to have to change because if we say boucher, woo, sloppy, it just doesn't sound very crisp. So instead of leaving that C there, we're going to have to make a little swap. That C is going to change to a QU before we attach the normal AR yo form ending in the preterite. So instead of this sloppy version of the verb, we're going to say yo busqué. Nice and crisp, easy to say. And this happens to all verbs that end in car in the yo form in the preterite. Busqué. Let's talk about llegar. So if I didn't make any changes, this would be yay hey. Doesn't really work. Sloppy, not super crisp. So we're going to have a change again. So in the yo form, it becomes llegué. So the G changes to a GU, and then we add on the normal ending for AR yo form preterite verb. So llegué, a lot more crisp, easy to say. Now what about almorzar? Well, when we have the Z, it actually needs to change as well. Almorcé doesn't seem that bad. But Z's, and you've seen this before probably with words like lapis, for example, change in some situations. So this one changes to a C before we add the ending. So we get yo almorcé with a C instead of a Z. So just be aware this is in the yo form only, and that these are just things you need to memorize, so when these verbs come up, you're like, yep, I got this, easy. So again, we've got busqué with that C that changes to a QU. but the other conjugations are normal. Buscaste, busco, buscamos, buscastes, and buscaron. The only one that's weird is the yo form because it's a car verb. So just keep that in mind. The only form affected here is yo in the preterite. Some other irregular verbs. The verb ver, to see, is irregular. Dar, to give, and ser, and ear. So ser, to be, and ear, to go. All irregular in the preterite. And we just have to memorize these conjugations because they're a bit funky. Now with ver, we've got vi, viste, vio, vimos, vistes, and vieron. Really, it's just irregular because you'll notice there's no accent marks. So it's like a normal ER verb. There's just no accents because it's so short. Now, luckily for us, that makes it pretty easy to remember. Also, DAR is going to work the same way. So it's going to look the same, except with a D in the front. Di, diste, dio, dimos, distes, and dieron. So again, we need to memorize these. So you take the first letter away, and they have the same endings. Now, if we keep that in mind, and we remember it's just that first letter, the endings disappear, should be pretty easy to keep these straight for their conjugations. And again, neither one of these have accent marks on any of their conjugations. So if we move along from these two verbs, next we've got ser and ir. They have the same exact conjugation. Fui, fuiste, fue, fuimos, fuistes, and fueron. Again, no accents, and we need to memorize the spelling. Now, how do you know which is which? Well, in context, you need to decide, oh, is this a case of ser, or is this a case of ir, to go? So some ways to look at that. Ser would include things like descriptions, things from doctor if you learned to use ser in those situations, whereas ir is going to be to go as in to a place. So you might see the word a for to, or you might see a location. That's how you can tell which verb's being used in context, even though they use the same irregular conjugations in the preterite tense. So some other irregular verbs in the preterite are listed here. Now you should have already learned these in the present tense, so hopefully you're familiar with these verbs and when to use them. So for example, poder is like can, and it's usually used with an infinitive, or tener uses special expressions like tener que to say someone has to do something. Now in the preterite, all of these are going to have spelling changes that affect their stems. Now, these are just things we need to memorize. But one of the important things to note, and these are different from GAR ZAR verbs with the spelling changes, these are going to affect all of their preterite conjugations. So every single conjugation they have will use a new stem for each of these verbs. Now, review what these mean. So DECIR means to say or to tell. ESTAR means to be, but for situations in place, so position, location, action, condition, and emotion, typically. Remember that that acronym can help you remember when to use it. HACER is to do or to make. Now, remember you can use that for things like to do your homework, to do the project, or to create something. Oh, so I'm going to make a project later. Just be aware that sometimes we see that verb in questions, like, oh, what did you do yesterday? But it's not going to be used in the reply because you replace it with the actual action that you did. So watch out for that verb. Then we've got poder, to be able, often used as can or can't. Poner, to put or to place. And tener, to have. Those are all the meanings of the verbs we're going to use today. Now all of them, like I said, have weird stems. They have spell changes. Now remember, the stem of a verb is what's left after you remove the ending. So if I've got hablar, I take off the AR, and I've got habl. Habl would be the stem because that's what's left over without the ending. So these verbs have weird stems listed in this red box up above. So instead of their typical ones like DECIR, I'm going to use di, D-I-J. For star, estuve. For HACER, I'm going to use is, except in the third person singular, so L-A-U-stead, I need to have a Z instead. that one's just something we need to remember, so I'm just going to put a note here off to the side. Remember that this one in parentheses we use for the third person singular conjugation in the predicate. So él, ella, usted. Then we got pud for poder, pus for poner, and tuv for tener. Those are their new stems for their conjugations. So every single conjugation needs to use that new stem, and we need to memorize that these happen in the preterite. So let's take a look at some conjugations and how these are going to work. Now, although these are irregular, they're actually less work because after you memorize the new stems, all of these verbs right here use the exact same verb endings for their conjugations. So again, we memorize the new stems, and then those stems get combined with these endings. E, iste, o, imos, istes, and hieron, except for the one with the asterisk, DECIR, and that's going to use eron without the I. Verbs with J at the end use this ending, eron, instead of hieron. Now, all of these verbs, again, use these for their conjugations, and notice there are no accent marks on any of these with these irregular spelling change verbs. Again, all of these verbs use these endings, so it doesn't matter which one from this initial list, they're all going to use these exact conjugation endings. So let's take tener for an example. We know tener's new stem is tuv, T-U-V. So I'm going to use that for each of my conjugations and add my endings after that. If I start with the stem, it's easier to remember not to forget to make it irregular. So once I've got tuv in all my conjugation spaces, then I can go back and add the endings from this chart. Tuve, tuviste, tuvo, tuvimos, tuvistes, and tuvieron. That's how I conjugate the irregular verb tener in the preterite tense, using its new stem with its new spelling and these endings. And this is how it's going to work for all of these verbs. Just make sure you have these boxes memorized so that way you remember the verbs that are irregular, what they mean, and how to conjugate. I know this video was a little longer, but I hope it was useful to see how some preterite tense irregular verbs work that are very common verbs. Make sure you memorize these changes, make flashcards, use practice conjugation sites, whatever's going to help you to memorize what happens with these verbs, so that when you see them, you just know this is how they work. Gracias y buena suerte.